Welcome to Mat 127, Elementary Statistics with Probability. I am Mr. Villamor, your instructor for this semester, and this video is the summary of the first section, Introduction to the Practice of Statistics. In this lesson, you should be able to describe what statistics means in the context of this course, explain the process of statistics, distinguish between qualitative and quantitative variables, distinguish between discrete and continuous variables, and determine the level of measurement of a variable. So let's talk about what statistics is. A lot of us, we have an idea when we first think about statistics, we think about it as just those numbers that describe things. But we are actually talking about the whole process of statistics. Here's a visual that we have. The basic thing that we start with in statistics is we have a question that we want to answer. That's identifying the question. Maybe it's an experiment we want to design, or maybe it's a survey. Next in the process is we collect the data. In this step, we will learn about sample, particularly how do we identify a sample that represents our population. Then the next step is organizing and summarizing the data we collected. We will use some graphs and do some statistical calculations using calculator. And then finally, the highlight of statistics, coming to a conclusion based on our findings. So that's basically the process of statistics. We have a question we want to answer, we collect data to answer it. We summarize the data either numerically or graphically, and then we make some inferences and draw some conclusions based on that. Now let's talk about population and sample. What's the difference? Population is every individual we might be looking at. For example, all Americans, and then the population is every single American. Meanwhile, sample is the selection from that population. For example, in an election survey, those who are conducting survey, they will just use a sample instead of asking all Americans. Now let's talk about what is a statistic. So when we look at our population and we calculate something about our population, we will call it a parameter, which we usually can't do because it's very large. For example, the average age of all FCC students. And then when we take a sample from our population and calculate something from that sample, we call it statistics or statistic. For example, the average age of a sample of 50 FCC students. Now, when we look at a statistic, we are just describing the average that we calculated from the sample. That's what we call the descriptive statistics, just factual, the average of our sample. Meanwhile, inferential statistics is when we draw some conclusions based on that. For example, descriptive is the average age of the students in this sample is 23. Inferential is the average age of all FCC students is 23. So descriptive is just factual. Inferential is when we extend that fact to the greater population. Okay, now so let's talk about types of data or variables. There are two categories, qualitative or quantitative. Qualitative variables allow for classification of individuals based on some attribute or characteristic. Quantitative variables provide numerical measures of individuals. Addition and subtraction can be performed on that values of quantitative variables and will provide meaningful results. So quantitative variables can be further split into two groups, discrete variable and continuous variable. So Discrete is a quantitative variable that has either a finite number of possible values or a countable number of values, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. A continuous variable is a quantitative variable that has an infinite number of possible values that are not countable. Now here's a graphical representation of the different ways to classify variables. Qualitative, from the word quality, is just descriptive. For example, hair color, political party, letter grade, etc. Quantitative provides numerical measures of an individual that has meanings when you add or subtract. For example, number of siblings, height, temperature, etc. Within quantitative, we have two general categories. We have discrete variables and continuous variables. Discrete variables are essentially variables you can count, 1, 2, 3, 4, and etc. Continuous variable has an infinite number of possible values that are not countable. For example, the distance of a car traveling in a city with a full tank of gas. This is continuous because we usually measure distance with miles, but there are more like, you know, feet, yards, inches, etc. It's continuous because we just rounded them to miles. Now, kind of related to the types of data are the levels of measurement. So instead of classifying the variables as qualitative or quantitative, we can assign level of measurement to the variable. First one is nominal level of measurement. It's just a category. Examples are eye color, gender, political party. Ordinal is categories with order. Examples are, course letter grade, A, B, C, D, education experiences, Likert scale, agree, neutral, disagree. For ABC, the letter grades, we know that A is higher than B and B is higher than C and so on. Educational experiences, it's in order, like master's is higher than bachelor's or more education than bachelor's and so on. Interval is quantitative, but ratios don't have meaning. For example, IQ, an IQ of a person that has an IQ of 80 versus someone who has an IQ of 160. Does that mean that they are twice as smart as the first person? There's no way that we can really compare them or those two ratios. Another example is temperature. For example, 90 degrees. Does 90 degrees twice as warm as 45 degrees? So the ratio doesn't have meaning. The last one is ratio. This is the most precise level of measurement. Ratio has meaning and zero has meaning. For example, distance commuting, in business, number of clients. Distance commuting, for example, if you're taking this course online, you're not really commuting, so you have zero distance of commuting, so zero has meaning. In business, zero number of clients, meaning you don't have any client. And one final note, the level of measurement is like a scale. The further you go down, the more precise of level of measurements. All right, to summarize this section, we talked about some of the key points. First, the process of statistics. We learned that there are four steps in the process of statistics. That's identifying the question, then we collect the data, and then we organize and summarize those data, and then come to a conclusion. We also talk about the population versus sample, where population is everybody and sample is the subset of the population. We have also talked about parameter versus statistic. When we calculate something about the population, that's the parameter, and when we calculate something about the sample, it's statistic. And then we have the types of data, qualitative and quantitative variables. And then within quantitative, we have discrete and continuous variables. And then finally, we have the level of measurements, the nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And also the precision um, of the levels of measurements. So that's it. Make sure to take a look and make yourself familiar with the full presentation with my notes and examples. My next video summary is section 2, which is all about observational studies versus design experiments. See you then.